In the summer of 2021, a retired forest ranger named Darlene Whitecalf was hiking a trail she had walked dozens of times before in the southern Black Hills of South Dakota, just west of the town of Custer, when a section of hillside she'd passed without thinking gave way beneath a late-season storm runoff and revealed a narrow opening in the rock that hadn't been there before. Or rather, hadn't been visible before. She almost didn't go in. The opening was tight, the light was failing, and she had no equipment. But she had a headlamp clipped to her pack from a camping trip the week before, and something about the way the air moved through that gap, the faint, cool exhale of a space that had been sealed for a long time, made her stop. She clicked on the light and went in sideways. What she found inside was not a small crack in the hillside. It was a campsite. Not an ancient pit house. Not a ceremonial chamber. Not a burial ground in the formal sense. A campsite, the kind of deliberately organized living space that you recognize immediately, even when you've never seen one 1,000 years old. There were objects placed with care. There were structural remains that had been built to last. And there were 23 things in that camp that, once the researchers arrived and began their work, turned out to be things that had no straightforward explanation. Things that didn't belong to any single culture, any single period, or any single corner of the continent. Things that told a story that still hasn't been fully written. Some of what you're about to hear has been presented at academic conferences. Some of it is still being debated in peer-reviewed journals. All of it is real. Subscribe right now, because number 1 on this list is the reason the lead researcher on this project told her university she needed 6 more months and a completely different set of specialists. And we're going to get there. Number 23 is the object that set the tone for everything that followed, and it looks at first glance like almost nothing. It was a piece of charred wood, roughly the size and shape of a large soup ladle, that had been partially worked into a pointed tool before being burned. Charred wood finds its way into archaeological contexts all the time, usually from cooking fires, hearths, or the kind of accidental burning that happens anywhere people live. This piece was different because of where it was sitting. It had been placed, not dropped or discarded, placed with deliberate positioning in a small stone-lined niche in the camp's eastern wall, at exactly the height a seated adult's right hand would reach without effort. The niche itself was not natural. Its edges had been smoothed, and its floor had been packed with fine sand that did not match the local geology. The charred tool, whatever it had been used for, was being stored. Someone had put it there, turned and walked away, and expected to come back. They never did. Radiocarbon dating of the charcoal came back to a range of approximately 1180 to 1240 CE, placing it squarely in the middle of the period when the Cahokia Mounds complex near modern St. Louis was at the peak of its influence, the largest pre-Columbian city north of Mexico. Whether this camp had anything to do with Cahokia is one of the questions this story keeps circling back to. Number 22 was a fire ring, which again sounds unremarkable until you examine it closely. The ring had been constructed from 27 stones, each one chosen for a specific size and shape, arranged in a precise circle with a diameter of exactly 4 feet. That precision would be notable in any context. What made it stranger was that 16 of those 27 stones were not local material. They were quartzite cobbles, rounded and smoothed by water, of a type that matches riverbeds in the Black Hills Canyon systems to the north, roughly 40 miles from the campsite. Someone had carried these stones a substantial distance and arranged them with measurement in mind. The stones alternated in a pattern of 2 local sandstone pieces, then 1 quartzite, then 2 sandstone, then 1 quartzite, all the way around the ring. That alternating pattern is not random. It is not the arrangement of someone who simply grabbed convenient rocks. It reflects a mind that was building something according to a plan, a mind that distinguished between these 2 types of stone for reasons that mattered to it, possibly symbolic, possibly functional, and that had a clear enough vision of the finished object to go and collect specific materials before beginning construction. Number 21 was a set of bone awls, 3 of them, bundled together with a thin cord that has been analyzed and identified as made from sinew, probably bison. Bone awls are among the most common tools found in pre-Columbian North American sites, used for everything from leatherworking to basket weaving to tattooing. What made these interesting was the material. All three awls were made from the same animal, and that animal was not bison, which would have been the expected local source. It was elk, which is present in the Black Hills. So not impossible, but the awls had been worked to a degree of refinement that goes well beyond functional utility. The tips were polished to near translucency. The shafts had been scraped absolutely smooth, and each one bore a single incised line that ran the full length of the shaft, positioned with such consistency across all three pieces that it appears to be a deliberate mark, a maker's mark, or a symbol of ownership or belonging. The cord binding them had been tied in a specific knot that one textile specialist consulted by the team identified as a technique with parallels in southwestern weaving traditions, specifically among the ancestral Puebloan peoples of what is now New Mexico and Arizona. Number 20 was a storage pit, roughly circular, about 18 inches deep and 24 inches in diameter, lined with flat stones and covered with a fitted slab that had been wedged firmly in place. The contents of that pit are where the story starts to complicate itself. Inside were the remains of plant material, mostly decomposed beyond identification, but with enough structure remaining for a botanist to determine that it included at least 4 distinct species. 2 of those species were native to the Black Hills and surrounding plains. 1 was native to the Mississippi Valley, and the 4th, the most intact specimen, was positively identified as a fragment of dried maize cob, a variety called northern flint, which agricultural historians associate with cultivation traditions that spread northward and westward from centers in what is now the eastern Midwest. The maize was not grown locally. It was brought here, and it was being stored deliberately, with care, as a resource worth protecting. In the center of the pit, resting on top of the plant material, was a small, rounded stone with a natural hole through it, the kind sometimes called a mano stone, smoothed by use, and almost certainly not placed there by accident. Number 19 was the first object in the camp that pointed unambiguously outward, toward a world much larger than the Black Hills. It was a fragment of obsidian, roughly 2 inches by 1.5 inches, not shaped into a tool, but clearly worked, with several pressure flakes removed from one edge in a way that suggests it was being tested or prepared for further reduction. Obsidian does not occur naturally anywhere in the Black Hills or in the surrounding plains of South Dakota. The nearest source is in Wyoming, in the Yellowstone volcanic region, roughly 300 miles to the west. But trace element analysis of this particular piece did not match Wyoming sources. It matched a source in the Jemez Mountains of northern New Mexico, a major obsidian quarry region associated with the ancestral Puebloan world, roughly 900 miles to the southwest. Someone carried this material, or traded for it across an enormous distance, and then carried it here. It was not the last object in this camp to point in that direction. Number 18 was a painted stone, a flat piece of local sandstone about 5 inches across, one face of which had been painted with a red ochre design. The design is simple, 4 concentric circles with a dot at the center, but simple does not mean insignificant. That particular symbol, the concentric circles with a central point, appears in rock art and portable art across an enormous range of pre-Columbian North American cultures, from the Southwest to the Great Lakes to the Southern Plains. It has been interpreted variously as a sun symbol, a map of water sources, a representation of the cosmos, and as a marker of sacred or liminal spaces. The ochre used for the paint is a high-quality iron oxide that doesn't match local Black Hills sources, but does match ochre deposits documented in the Badlands region to the east, suggesting the material was intentionally sourced from a distance. The stone had been placed face up at the center of the camp, roughly equidistant from the fire ring, the storage pit, and the sleeping area that the team identified in the camp's northwestern quadrant. Its position suggests it functioned as a kind of anchor for the space, the visual and possibly spiritual center of everything built around it. Number 17 was a bison scapula that had been modified into a digging tool, a type sometimes called a hoe or a garden blade, which is exactly what it sounds like. These tools are common in agricultural contexts throughout pre-Columbian North America, particularly in the Missouri River Valley where they were used extensively in the gardens of the Mandan, Hidatsa, and Arikara peoples. finding one in the Black Hills, which are generally considered marginal agricultural territory due to elevation and climate, is unexpected. It suggests either that someone was attempting cultivation in the immediate area, or that this tool was carried here from a more agricultural context farther east. The blade edge showed clear wear consistent with use in soil, not just symbolic or ceremonial handling. This was a working tool, used for actual digging, and it had been maintained carefully. The edge resharpened after use, the surface cleaned of soil residue before being stored in the camp. Whoever owned this tool took care of it. They planned to use it again. Number 16 was a set of 3 ceramic sherds that, when fitted together, turned out to represent approximately 1/3 of a small ceramic vessel. The vessel, reconstructed as best as possible from the available fragments, would have been roughly the size of a large apple, with a rounded body and a short neck. The paste, the mixture of clay and temper material used to make the ceramic, contained crushed shell as a tempering agent. Shell-tempered ceramics are characteristic of the Mississippian tradition, the same broad cultural complex that built Cahokia. Shell-tempered pottery does not appear in the Black Hills in any abundance. Its presence here, in a camp that already has a Mississippian radiocarbon date range, starts to feel less like coincidence and more like a pattern. The exterior of the vessel fragments bore traces of a dark residue that may represent use for storage or cooking of organic material. The interior was smooth and clean. One of the sherds had a small thumb-sized depression near the base of the neck that appears to be a deliberate mark made before firing, the kind of intentional touch that potters across many traditions have used to identify their work. Number 15 brought the first genuine argument among the research team. It was a small carved antler piece, roughly 3 inches long, shaped into what most of the team agreed was a stylized animal figure, probably a bird. The carving was skilled and deliberate, the kind of object made by someone with a well-established carving tradition behind them. The argument was about which tradition. 2 researchers saw in the piece clear formal resemblances to carved ornaments associated with the Plains Woodland period, a broad archaeological horizon dating roughly from 500 BCE to 1000 CE. One researcher insisted the stylistic details, particularly the way the wings were rendered and the proportions of the head, were more consistent with Great Lakes Hopewell objects from an even earlier period. A 4th researcher pointed out that certain features of the beak and the stylized eye matched conventions visible in carved objects from the Fremont culture of what is now Utah. None of them were definitively wrong. None of them were definitively right. The object sits at an intersection of traditions that, under conventional archaeological thinking, should not have much to do with each other. Subscribe right now, if you haven't already, because we're still in the middle section of this list, and the objects are only going to get harder to explain. Number 14 was a length of braided cordage, about 3 feet long, and surprisingly well preserved due to the cool, dry conditions of the camp's interior. The cord was made from plant fiber, specifically from the inner bark of dogbane, a plant native to the region and widely used for cordage production by peoples across North America. What was notable about this particular cord was its construction. It had been braided from 4 strands rather than the 2 or 3 strand twists that are most common in Plains cordage traditions. A 4-strand flat braid of this type is associated primarily with southwestern textile traditions, specifically with peoples living in what is now Arizona and New Mexico. At one end of the cord, a series of knots had been tied in a sequence that one ethnobotanist on the team recognized as resembling a recording knot system, a technique for encoding information in the pattern and placement of knots. Whether this particular cord is actually encoding information or simply showing decorative knotwork is still being debated, but the question itself is remarkable. Number 13 was a projectile point, but not a typical one. It was made from Knife River flint, a distinctive brown translucent chert that outcrops only in what is now western North Dakota, roughly 400 miles to the northeast. Knife River flint was one of the most widely traded lithic materials in all of pre-Columbian North America, found at sites from the Gulf Coast to the Canadian Shield, so its presence in the Black Hills is not extraordinary by itself. What was extraordinary about this particular point was its size and style. It was large, nearly 5 inches long, and shaped in the classic form of a Clovis point, the fluted, bifacially worked projectile associated with some of the earliest well-documented human presence in North America, dating to roughly 13,000 years ago. This point, however, was not 13,000 years old. Its radiocarbon date fell in the same general window as the rest of the camp, around the 12th century CE. Someone, 1,000 years ago, was deliberately making and using Clovis-style tools long after that technological tradition was supposed to have ended. They were either preserving a very old tradition or they had found and were copying ancient points as objects of significance. Either explanation is striking. Leave a comment right now and tell me which one you think is more likely. I read every comment on this channel. Number 12 was a collection of pigment cakes, 4 of them, each roughly the size of a large marble and made from different materials. The first was red ochre, iron oxide, common and widely distributed. The second was a white material identified as kaolin, a fine white clay associated with deposits in the Black Hills and in the Missouri River breaks. The third was a yellow-orange material that matched limonite, another iron oxide compound. And the fourth was a dark blue-gray material that took the team considerably longer to identify. It turned out to be galena, lead sulfide, ground fine, and mixed with an organic binder. Galena was used as a pigment and also as a prestige material in the Mississippian world, where it appears in elite burial contexts and in ceremonial deposits. It was traded across vast distances. The closest galena sources to the Black Hills are in the upper Mississippi Valley of Illinois and Wisconsin, roughly 1,000 miles to the east. Someone carried it here, kept it with their other pigments, and used it, or intended to use it. The 4 pigments together represent a working artist's toolkit, someone who was making things with color, here, in this camp, in the middle of the Black Hills. Number 11 was a small antler tine that had been incised with a series of marks arranged in 4 groups separated by longer lines. The groups contained 7 marks, then 5 marks, then 4 marks, then 7 marks again. Researchers have proposed several interpretations: a lunar calendar, a count of days between events, a record of individuals or objects, or a game scoring system. None of these can be confirmed or ruled out. What can be said with confidence is that this was deliberate counting, recording, or notation by someone who understood the value of writing things down, or marking them in a durable medium so they wouldn't be forgotten. The tine had been drilled with a small hole near its thicker end, suggesting it was worn or carried as a pendant, which means the notation was something the person wanted to keep close. Whatever those marks counted, they mattered enough to carry. Number 10 was a groundstone tool of a type called a mano, a handheld grinding stone used against a flat slab called a metate to process seeds, pigments, or other materials. Manos are ubiquitous across pre-Columbian North America, and this one would have been entirely unremarkable, except for one detail. Its working surface had been ground into a concave curve rather than remaining flat, a feature that archaeologists associate specifically with the processing of very hard seeds or nuts that need to be confined to the center of the grinding surface to prevent them from rolling away. The plant remains in the storage pit, included what may have been wild sunflower seeds, which are hard and round and would benefit from exactly this kind of concave grinding surface. The connection between these 2 objects, the mano and the storage pit, separated by about 6 feet of camp floor, suggests a coherent domestic economy, a thought-out way of life that involves specific tools for specific tasks, carried out in specific places. This camp was not a hasty shelter. It was a home, or something very close to one. Number 9 was a piece of worked leather, roughly 10 inches square, that had survived in fragmentary but partially readable condition due to the same dry, cool environment that preserved so much else in this camp. The leather had been treated with some kind of animal fat or grease, a tanning technique that is common across numerous traditions. What was notable was the decoration. The surface of the leather had been incised with a design, and that design was not abstract. It showed clearly and deliberately a stylized human figure in profile, wearing what appears to be an elaborate headdress, holding an object in one raised hand that may be a staff or a weapon, and standing above a series of wavy horizontal lines that most likely represent water. The imagery is consistent with visual traditions associated with the southeastern ceremonial complex, the same broad religious and artistic network that produced the copperplate iconography at Cahokia and at ceremonial sites across the southeast. Finding this imagery on worked leather in a Black Hills campsite is like finding a painting from the Florentine Renaissance in a shepherd's hut in Iceland. The imagery is real. It is fully realized. It has traveled an enormous distance from its cultural heartland. And it ended up here. Number 8 was the first object in the camp with an obvious celestial implication. It was a stick, a simple straight length of wood about 14 inches long, sharpened at one end and notched at 5 specific points along its length. The notches were not evenly spaced. Their positions were measured with care, but the measurement was not based on equal division of the stick's length. A solar astronomer consulted by the team took the measurements of the notch positions and, working backward through astronomical calculations, found a coherent explanation. The notch positions correspond, at the latitude of the Black Hills during the 12th century CE, to the positions of the rising sun on the horizon at the winter solstice, the spring equinox, a midpoint between those two dates, the summer solstice, and the fall equinox. This stick was a calendar or a sighting tool, a device for tracking the year by the sun's movement. It joins the mica star map from the Mississippi River Cave and a growing catalog of pre-Columbian astronomical objects that suggest a widespread and sophisticated interest in the sky across the continent's many cultures. Number 7 was a piece of worked stone that defies easy categorization. It was made from catlinite, the distinctive red pipestone quarried at what is now Pipestone National Monument in southwestern Minnesota, a material that was and remains considered sacred by many indigenous peoples across the continent. Catlinite is found at sites across a wide geographic range because of its sacred status and the long tradition of trading it. This piece, however, was not a pipe. It was a flat rectangular tablet, about 2 inches by 3 inches, incised on one face with a series of symbols arranged in 3 rows. The symbols are small and precise, and do not match any identified North American rock art or portable art tradition in the research team's reference database. One researcher noted a structural similarity to symbols found in a small number of objects from the Fremont culture of Utah. Another noted resemblance to markings on certain Hopewell tablets from Ohio. A third said that if she had seen this object without knowing where it came from, she would have said it was a seal, a stamp, the kind of object used to impress a design into clay or pigment as a mark of identity or authority. The idea of a personal seal in a pre-Columbian North American context is not as far-fetched as it might sound. Comment right now and tell me what you think those symbols might mean. The community on this channel always has ideas worth reading. Number 6 was a ceramic pipe, which is a common enough type of artifact across many North American archaeological contexts. This one was a platform pipe, meaning the bowl was mounted on a curved base platform rather than directly on the stem, a form associated especially with the Hopewell tradition, and with later Plains pipe-making traditions descended from it. The pipe was made from a fine buff-colored clay that matched a source in the eastern Dakotas, and it had been used. Its interior showed carbon staining from repeated burning. What set it apart was the bowl's decoration. The bowl had been modeled in the form of a small animal head, and that animal was a beaver, rendered with careful attention to its characteristic features: the broad, flat muzzle, the small, round ears, the incised lines suggesting fur. Beaver effigies appear in Hopewell ceremonial contexts in the Ohio Valley, where the beaver held specific symbolic significance. Their appearance in the northern plains in a later context suggests either the persistence of very old symbolic traditions across enormous distances and centuries, or an active connection between peoples who were sharing not just objects, but the meanings behind them. Number 5 was a bundle of feathers, partially decomposed but remarkably identifiable. The bundle had been wrapped in a piece of the same treated leather as the incised piece described earlier, which helped preserve it, and when the conservators opened it, they found 4 distinct feathers in reasonable condition. 3 were identified as golden eagle feathers, which is consistent with the sacred status of eagle feathers across virtually all plains and mountain cultures. The 4th was different. It was larger, a primary flight feather from a bird that the ornithologist consulted by the team identified as a whooping crane. Whooping cranes are a species with a very specific migratory range, traveling between breeding grounds in what is now northern Canada and wintering grounds along the Gulf Coast of Texas. They cross the Great Plains in a narrow corridor, and they have been documented in Black Hills contexts archaeologically, so a whooping crane feather here is not impossible. But whooping crane feathers do not appear frequently in the pre-Columbian record of this region. Their symbolic significance is attested primarily in cultures much farther east and south. This feather, carefully bundled with sacred eagle feathers and wrapped in decorated leather, was being kept as something precious and meaningful, not just a random bird find. Number 4 was a carved wooden object that the team spent considerable time debating before settling on a functional identification. It was about 8 inches long, roughly cylindrical with a flattened underside, and it had been incised along its entire length with a continuous spiral groove. At one end, it narrowed to a rounded tip. At the other, it had a shallow socket, a bowl-like depression about 1 inch across and half an inch deep. The team eventually concluded that this was a fire-making tool, a hand-drill hearthboard socket, the kind of piece used in a bow drill or hand-drill fire-starting system. The socket showed the characteristic polishing and slight carbonization of a piece that had been used repeatedly to generate friction heat. But the spiral groove along its length went far beyond any functional requirement. That groove was purely decorative or meaningful, invested with attention and work that served no mechanical purpose. The object had been made beautiful as well as functional. Whoever carved it was not separating the useful from the meaningful. For them, the two were the same thing. Number 3 was a shell bead necklace, or most of one. It consisted of 42 beads strung on a length of sinew cord, ranging from small disc-shaped beads to larger tubular beads to 3 beads that were simply unmodified small shells with naturally occurring holes. The disc beads were made from marine shell, specifically from the Gulf whelk, the same type used for shell gorgets in Mississippian contexts. Gulf shell in the Black Hills is not surprising, because shell bead trade networks are among the most extensively documented long-distance exchange systems in pre-Columbian North America. What was notable about this particular necklace was its combination of materials. Interspersed among the shell beads were 11 beads made from turquoise. Turquoise does not occur naturally in the Black Hills. The nearest high-quality turquoise sources are in New Mexico, Colorado, and Nevada. The combination of Gulf shell and southwestern turquoise on a single necklace, strung on plains bison sinew, in a camp in the Black Hills, is a physical map of trade connections stretching across the entire breadth of the continent, east to west, north to south, concentrated on the body of a single person. Number 2 was a flat piece of bone, a large mammal rib section, roughly 8 inches long and 4 inches wide, that had been sanded smooth on both faces and then used as a drawing surface. On one face, in a dark pigment that analysis identified as charcoal mixed with animal fat, someone had drawn a map. Not a symbolic representation or an abstract pattern. A map. The drawing showed a river system with 2 main branches meeting at a central confluence, several smaller tributaries marked with short lines, and a set of dots arranged in 3 clusters that almost certainly represent settlements or campsites. A landscape feature in the upper left corner, rendered as a jagged line that archaeologists and geologists both independently interpreted as a mountain ridgeline, corresponds closely to the profile of the Black Hills Massif, as seen from the eastern plains. The central confluence on the map, taking that ridgeline identification as a starting point, aligns with the junction of the White River and one of its major northern tributaries. If this reading is correct, the camp where this map was found is actually marked on the map itself as one of the 3 settlement clusters. Someone was here, knew exactly where here was, and drew it. They knew the landscape well enough to record it accurately. They were not lost, not passing through, not confused about where they were. They were home. And now we reach number 1. This is the object that the lead researcher described in a recorded interview as the point at which she stopped thinking about the project as an interesting regional find and started thinking about it as something that might require a significant rewriting of what we think we know about pre-Columbian North America. It was found at the very back of the camp, in a small alcove formed by 2 naturally leaning slabs of sandstone, the most protected and most intentionally private space in the entire site. It had been placed there with obvious care, elevated slightly off the ground on a small platform of flat stones and wrapped in multiple layers of material. The outer wrapping was a piece of tanned leather. Inside that was a layer of dried plant material, a kind of packing or insulation. Inside that was a sheet of hammered copper, thin but intact. And inside all of that was a small ceramic vessel, beautifully made, thin-walled, fired to a pale gray, and decorated on its exterior with an intricate design painted in black and red. The vessel was sealed. Its mouth had been closed with a fitted disc of carved bone, and then sealed with a resinous material that had kept it airtight for the better part of 800 years. When the conservators opened it, they found it contained a substance, a dark, partially dried material that the analytical chemists who examined it identified as containing cacao, Theobroma cacao, the plant from which chocolate is made, native to tropical Mesoamerica, and not grown anywhere near the Black Hills or anywhere near North America above Mexico. Cacao has been found at a small number of pre-Columbian North American sites before this, most famously in ceramic vessels at Chaco Canyon in New Mexico, where its presence confirmed trade connections reaching deep into Mexico. But the Black Hills are 400 miles farther from Mesoamerica than Chaco Canyon, and this vessel was not in a great house or a ceremonial center. It was in a camp. Someone who lived in this camp, who ground seeds with a concave mano, who stored northern flint maize in a lined pit, who slept in the northwestern corner of a space bounded by a carefully built fire ring, who kept an eagle feather and a whooping crane feather bundled in decorated leather, and a necklace that spanned the continent from the Gulf to the Rockies. That person also had cacao. They had brought it here, or had traded for it across the full length of a continent, and they had sealed it carefully in the finest vessel in the camp, and placed it in the most protected spot they could find. Not because they needed to preserve a food supply, because this was something precious, something that connected them to a world enormously larger than the hills around them, something worth keeping. Here is what these 23 objects add up to when you look at them together. They describe a person, or a small group of people, who were operating in the center of North America in the 12th century CE, with connections reaching to the Gulf Coast, to Mesoamerica, to the Great Lakes, to the Southwest, to the Pacific Flyway, to the astronomical traditions of multiple cultures, and to a mathematical and notational practice sophisticated enough to encode information in knots and marks and a spiral-grooved fire drill. This was not an isolated community scraping by at the edge of the known world. This was a node in a network. This was someone who knew things and knew people, and had been places, and had brought back proof of all of it. The Black Hills themselves have been understood for a long time as a sacred center for the Lakota and for other Plains peoples, a place of spiritual gravity that drew people toward it. But what these objects suggest is that this gravitational pull is older than we thought, and that the people it drew were not passive recipients of geography. They were active participants in a continental conversation that we are only beginning to have the tools to read. Drop a comment right now and tell me which of these 23 objects you find most significant. Tell me which one you would have picked up first. The conversation in the comments on this channel is one of the best reasons I keep making these videos, and I want to hear what you think. Subscribe if you haven't already. Share this with someone who still thinks pre-Columbian North America was a collection of isolated, simple societies, and I'll see you in the next one.